Okay, everybody, welcome to the next installment of our free virtual class on data and macro development. We're delighted today to have Julieta Caunedo, who's one of the world's experts on macro approaches to understanding agriculture, on its role in structural change and development. Before we begin the lecture, I want to make one announcement, which is that STEG has a ongoing call for PhD research proposals. The due date is May 20th. So please send us some proposals. Can't fund all of them, but we have some funds available to help PhD student research on these topics. So we look forward to seeing your submissions. So Julieta will talk today about agriculture data, and she'll talk for about an hour, and then we'll do questions live. If you're one of the panelists, please mute yourself, and I'm going to get dictatorial powers pretty soon. I'm going to mute you if your mic is off. At the end, we'll ask you to unmute and ask questions, and then if you're not a panelist, you're listening in, type your questions. We'll do our best to answer them, and then at the end, we can take a few. Live. Okay, thanks, Julieta. Please take it away.
Okay, thank you. Let me just share the screens for today. Okay, everybody can see it. I would appreciate a thumbs up. Good. So thanks a lot for asking me to do that. I will like to apologize because I'm a bit under the weather, but I'll try to do my best to be clear today. So today I want to talk about agricultural data, and I want to talk about agricultural data insofar it's important to understanding economic development. So you may wonder, why do we study agriculture? So I think, surprisingly enough, a quarter of the world's population still works in agriculture. And agriculture accounts for more than a third of the labor force in Africa and Asia. And it's about a fifth of the labor force in middle-income countries. So even within middle-income countries, there's a lot of people that still work in this sector. Now, if you want to understand the process of economic development, we know that process is accompanied by changes in production, in agricultural production, from all consumption towards market production, and a systematic labor reallocation out of agriculture into non-agriculture. But perhaps the most important reason why we study agriculture is that if you look at cross-country differences in agricultural productivity, those are the largest among sectors. Okay, so the agricultural productivity gaps are larger than in manufacturing productivity gaps across countries. So this is an argument that even Simon Kuznets made in the 60s. You have a lot of people working in agriculture, and that's the sector where in poor countries productivity is relatively low. So just in a very basic accounting sense, it is an important sector to study because a lot of the aggregate productivity differences across countries may be driven by this gap in agriculture. Okay. Now, this is from a lecture that ACOS gave 3 weeks ago. Here is kind of what's the magnitude of these agricultural productivity gaps. You see that value added per worker relative to the US in the y-axis, right? You see the variation goes from 1 to, say, 1/128, so very, very low productivity in agriculture relative to the differences in GDP per worker, okay? And these are the largest across all the sectors. If you put out manufacturing here, you will see that the differences are much smaller, okay? Now, what type of questions are important if you want to think about these productivity gaps? Well, the first obvious question is kind of what are the sources of cross-country agricultural productivity differences? And I spend a good chunk of this lecture trying to talk about this from a macro perspective. And then once we settle that, you want to start thinking about whether average disparities are driven by heterogeneity within countries and potentially misallocation. And I think once you answer those 2 questions, or at least we provide data that could be useful to think about those 2, I think an obvious question to ask next is agricultural productivity growth a requirement to economic development, and to what extent? Of course, I will have very little to say about this last question here, but I think it's important when you're thinking about the data, think what type of questions you may want to answer, okay? Now, in answering the first question, I'm going to be working with what is called accounting, okay? Gonna do basic additions of different channels. Then when we talk about heterogeneity within countries, I'm going to start talking about measurement challenges and potential drivers of that heterogeneity that we see. And of course, again, I'm not going to be able to talk about this last question, but I think this is an important question that we should all be thinking about, because it's a current debate as of what are what is the role of agricultural productivity growth for economic development, and that links literally to push and pull effects in development. Okay, so that's a broad introduction to what we are going to be doing today. So what I want to do in terms of content is I'm going to go from the macro to the micro. Not because there is any orders of importance, but mostly because this is an audience in macro development. So I want to organize it from stuff that is cleaner and where we know the problems to stuff that is perhaps interesting, but more heterogeneous and where there will be more measurement problems. Okay. To do that, I'm going to start talking about cross-country agricultural productivity differences. Then I'm going to link it back to sectorial productivity gaps. And finally, I'm going to be talking about heterogeneity within the agricultural sector, the micro of this problem. Okay? Okay. These slides, I debated whether to put it or not. I think basically what I did here is I put together basic data sources that we have available if you want to think about the agricultural sector, okay? I organize it with data that is available across countries and data that is country specific. Of course, this is not an exhaustive list, but many of these data sets are going to pop up as I discuss the issues of measurement today, okay? All the data sets are going to be linked in the slides. So if you download the slides from the web, you're going to be able to go directly to the sources or to the papers that reference this data. Okay. I'm not going to spend too much time on this, but this is basically your slide to go to. If you don't remember, you needed something quickly, this is where you go to find the reference. Okay. And of course, if we may update this slide as we go along. Okay, so I want to start thinking about agricultural productivity accounting. Okay, the object of study for me are going to be output per worker. It's basically the measure that I was looking at in my second slide. Okay, I'm going to look at output per worker in the agricultural sector for a country I at time t. Okay. And the way I'm going to do that is I'm going to pose a production technology that is going to depend on some factor A, that is going to be a measure of productivity. For lack of a better word, there's going to be some sort of residual in there. There is going to be capital labor ratios, okay? So basically the elasticity of output per worker to capital labor ratios is going to be alpha K. It's going to be some factor share for capital. There's going to be land. So labor productivity is also going to be a function of land per worker, or if you want, the average employment per farm or per acre. And the elasticity of output per worker to land per worker is going to be alpha L, the factor share. Now, in general, there is no reason to believe that there are constant returns to scale in these production technologies. So in principle, the factor share, the capital, the payments to capital, the payments to land, and the payments to labor may not add up to, say, 100. There might be increasing, decreasing returns to scale. And therefore, the level of employment in agriculture may be potentially important for this accounting. Okay? Now, what are the elements? So what is the type of exercise that we want to do if we do accounting? We have measurement for output per worker. And now we want to understand what is the contribution of each of these terms to differences in output per worker in agriculture across countries, okay? Now, to do that, we're gonna have to have measures of real output, okay? Now, if we wanna measure real output, you may wanna have and do international comparisons, you may wanna have PPP agricultural prices, okay? The original work of Prasada Rao allows you to do that. Faustat will do it, but the prices are not, the deflators in Faustat are not PPP adjustment. So that's going to generate some variation. I don't possibly have time to talk too much about why we want to do this PPP adjustment, but if you go back to another course that STEG put together a few years back, I talked extensively as of why PPP adjustment might be useful and what type of bias it may or may not introduce, okay? The other thing that you need to do this measurement is you need factor shares. Factor shares, we'll talk about it extensively in a few minutes, but one easy way to get at these factor shares is to use the study that Fugli did and that is available through the USDA website to be able, and is based also on Faustat, to be able to infer what these factor shares are. There is a fair amount of imputation, but it's going to allow you to measure alpha K, alpha N, alpha L. Now, land. You also need land, and land, the problem is that not all land is born equal in agriculture. Some land is used for crops, some land is used for pasture. Again, I think Fugli 2015 will give you the best measures of these if you want to do accounting cross countries, okay? In the sense that these measures of land are adjusted for the type of uses. And then you need labor. And the typical measure of labor that is put here is salaried labor. That might be a problem in agriculture, particularly when levels of informality in agricultural labor are really really high, sorry. So we'll talk about it in a few slides, okay? And the other thing that you need is potentially, if you say want to directly measure this employment per acre, you may want to just get an idea of average employment per farm, and you can check the paper by Tasso Adamopoulos and Diego Restuccia that you do this measurement from the World Census of Agriculture. Okay, go back to the slide on resources. You're going to see the reference there. The last thing that you need is you need a measure of capital, K. Okay, and again, here there are different measures that are available. There is data from Fugli from the study of Fugli. That's similar to the data that is available from a paper by Larsen et al. Okay, and then we have our own measure controlling for quality. But I'll get back to this in a few slides again. Now, what is the problem with this? If you notice right here, I listed like, I don't know, 6, 7 different studies with different sources to try to get at the components of agricultural productivity, that contribute to agricultural productivity. What is the biggest challenge here is we don't have these nice harmonized data a la Penward tables that we can do to do this study, where we are sure that the deflators are the correct deflators, where we have some measures of capital, land, labor that are controlling for quality. We may not have it completely, but at least we have some idea of that. So it's a little bit of a patchy exercise at this point. So let me talk a little bit about each of these components and kind of what is the data available and what are the challenges. So the first thing that you need to measure is the labor input. Now, the labor input is where you have most of the data available. That's very much available. That's one of the advantages of this. You can go to the Groningen data set, you can go to Faustat, you can go to IPIMS, and build some measure of employment in the agriculture sector. The other nice thing about the labor input is that you can link it to measures of human capital, like the ones Todd was talking about in the past. So you could potentially talk about labor services, controlling for differences in human capital too. Now, the big challenge in measuring employment is how do you properly account for self-employment? And self-employment is particularly problematic when you're going to be looking at poor countries, because that's a key input in family farming. And this is going to come back again when we talk about the micro data. And it's good that Doug is here because Doug wrote a whole paper on how do we adjust factor shares when there is a systematic differences in self-employment between poor and rich countries. And I would encourage you to look at that work, to think about how do we even start thinking about that adjustment in the aggregate. Okay. So bottom line, labor seems to be easy to measure. There is an issue of self-employment that might bias our results in terms of the cross-country comparison, but there might be strategies out there to solve it. Capital. Capital is always difficult. So it's difficult even in developed countries, okay? There are two sources of data that I measure, Larson et al. And Faustad. If you just want to compute stocks, one of them uses international prices to deflate the capital stock. The other one does not. And it turns out that that makes a bit of the difference on the levels of the stocks that you get across countries and the differences across countries that you get. Now, the biggest problem is that the machinery series in FAO has been discontinued. So if you try to go and get measures of these for recent years, you're not going to find it. It's not there anymore. Okay. Now, what are the challenges for measure in capital? Technically, what you want to measure here in capital is capital services. Okay. Now, if you think about agriculture doesn't use a single capital good, right? It uses tractors, it uses sprayers, it uses different implements. So there is all this heterogeneity in capital that immediately are going to say, well, when I measure this aggregate capital in an economy, how do I aggregate these things? How do I aggregate tractors and sprayers? Well, we're not going to reinvent the wheel. People that have been doing accounting even in the aggregate, we all know that the correct way to do that is to impute rental costs. So basically to aggregate total expenses of different capital types using the rental costs, okay? Now, getting measures of these rental costs or even the asset values is really tough, okay? But there is a lot of return from getting these rental costs and these asset values well measured. If you want to see one of the returns of doing something like that, is in a paper that I have with Elisa Keller, we use these differences in rental costs, in prices of all the new equipment to literally measure systematic disparities in quality. Okay, and that's the link. That's the link to the slides of the paper that are going to be more digestible if you want to understand exactly how we use that data. But the bottom line here is that if we want to measure better capital services, we need to have measures of rental costs or asset values or asset prices, and we have very little of that, let alone systematic disparities across countries. The ICP has been doing some of that effort, and I would encourage you to look at those series, but I think there's a lot more work to be done there. Now, the third piece of the puzzle is we want measures of land, okay? Now, as I mentioned before, Faustad offers standard measures of arable land. Fugly is going to differentially aggregate pasture and croplands, which is a slightly better measure because it's going to tell you that this land is not all born equal. There are other quality adjustments that you can do on the quality of land. And there is this amazing source that is called the AgroMaps that is going to allow you to build some other quality adjustments of the quality of the land. Okay. Now, something that people have used these AgroMaps data to study is they have used this quality of land to try to infer potential yields, okay, from a piece of land. So in principle, if you know the agronomical characteristics of a plot, you could say, okay, what are the potential yields that this plot of land will have at best if it was used in the best possible way, agronomically speaking, okay? And it seems that if you were to do something like that, the gains in productivity will be huge, okay? Now, there is an obvious question of, are these potential yields, agronomical yields, ever realized, okay? And potentially whether these yields are changing with climate change, okay? So that's point number one. Point number two is that, again, if you want to measure land, technically what you should be measuring are land services, okay? And again, you need measurements of rental costs or asset values to infer the services of the land in every period, okay? And a directly related question to this is, well, do distortions in land market affect the returns and the services that you get from that land, okay? So that thing that we call L and seems very easy to measure is not just, you just don't want to count for area. Potentially, there is a lot of adjustment that you can do to get the services that are provided by that piece of land in production, okay? The last piece of the puzzle is that you need measures of the factor share. Okay. Now, these factor shares there are estimates that are available in rich countries that comes from CLEMS has many sectors, but agriculture is one of them. Or again, the study by Fugli has provided measures of the factor shares, which in my opinion are one of the best ones that are out there. But there is a fair amount of extrapolation from countries where we do have data and we can properly measure factor shares, and countries where we don't have data and we just need to extrapolate. Now, what is this factor share? The way you measure factor shares is basically the payments to capital, or say the share of capital is the payments of capital, RK times K, over the cost of, the total production. The share of land is the same. The rental rate of land times the stock of land, those are the services received from the land, over the total output. And the labor share is the same, is the wages, the total cost in labor, divided by output, okay? Now, as you notice, if you want to compute factor shares, rental rates are key, which is what I was trying to mention before, right? Because you want to get these services. These rental rates are typically estimated from some sort of no arbitrage condition that links relative prices, so the price of capital, to a discount factor and a depreciation rate. So basically, if you want better measures of the rental rates, you're going to have better measures of prices and depreciation rates. The bottom line from all this is that to improve the measurement of the services of capital, land, and the factor shares, we need more data on prices. And particularly that data is lacking in poor countries. Okay? Now, let me just summarize this. So basically what I did is I posed a production technology. I'll tell you what output, how to decompose output per worker between total factor productivity, the effect of the level effect potentially from non-constant return to scale technology, capital labor ratios, and land to labor ratios. So now the question is, okay, are there a handful of countries where I can potentially do this accounting and say, what are the sources of these output per worker gaps, okay, relative to the US, for example? So this is what I'm going to show you here. So first focus on the first column here. So what I have is the ratio between output per worker in the US relative to output per worker in a country. So if so for Brazil, that's 5.4, which means that productivity in the US measured as output per worker is 5.4 times larger than on average in Brazil for these years. I hope that's clear. If you look at China, the difference is much larger. The US is 30 times more productive than China for these years, and is 64 times more productive than India. Okay. Now, okay, these are the output per worker measures. What is generating in an accounting sense these disparities? Basically, what I did here is I separated capital labor ratios, okay? And capital labor ratios have two components. One that is just the quality of the capital. So some capital is terrible and some capital is better, right? Or there are better quality machines in rich countries than there are in poor countries. If you ask, okay, of the the fact that the US is 5.4 times more productive than Brazil, how much of that comes because Brazil uses worse quality capital? Well, this accounting says 38.5 or 40% of that comes because it uses worse quality capital. 2% of that comes because they have differential capital labor ratios. So that's a tiny effect. And here you already see what's the importance of measuring quality. So if you don't measure quality, you would have said, capital labor ratios are very similar across countries. They cannot be important to explain these massive differences in output per worker. Land per worker, or employment per unit of acre, that explains 47%. So another half, okay? And then you get the level of employment mattering because factor shares do not add up to one. But I'm not gonna talk too much about it. Now, so what's the punchline from this exercise? From this exercise, what you learn is that somewhere between 12 and 50% of the disparities that we see in output per worker across countries come from capital quality. Between 2 to 10% come from capital per worker. So that's a tiny part, a smaller part. And then between 30 and 50% come from average farm sizes. Now, if you notice, I'm only looking at this handful of countries. You may be wondering, okay, what happens if I do this for many countries? Well, we couldn't do the quality adjustment for many of these countries. But if you take, say, the numbers that Adamopoulos and Restuccia measure, just looking at how much the differences in farm sizes contribute to differences in output per worker across countries, they also say somewhere around 50%. So I hope this highlights why this accounting exercise that macro development people often do is important to understand the proximate sources of these disparities in output gaps. Basically, what we learn is that half of these come from farm sizes, and say 40% of that comes from quality, and the rest will come from differences in capital labor ratios. Why is that important? Because that's already starting to pinpoint to what type of distortions of channels we will need to start thinking about when we think about output gaps across countries. Okay, it's kind of interesting not to see questions, but I'll keep going.
There are plenty of questions. Doug is trying his best to answer them.
Okay. Okay, so if you notice what I've done so far is I've done what is called value-added accounting. Why value-added? Because I basically said that the output produced in the agricultural sector is the product of combining capital and labor and land, okay? Now, in principle, that's not exactly how agricultural production happens. You could have done gross output accounting. What's the main difference? Whether you think about the role of intermediate inputs as a contributor to productivity differences or not. And we know that changes in intermediate input usage are important to explain productivity differences. In agriculture, they are very important. That's a paper by Donovan in Restart in 2017, and more general, there's a paper in the AJ Macro from Padinger. So in principle, there is no reason why you want to do the accounting solely on value added. Value added is easier, but if you happen to have the luxury of have some measures of intermediate inputs, there might be value in trying to understand the systematic differences in intermediate input usage with development. Now, until today, the best estimates available on intermediate input use are based, to my knowledge, on Prasada Rao in 93. There are two problems with that. They are dated, and they're basically based on a handful of intermediates. So in principle, there is a lot of room to improve our measures of intermediate input usage cross-country. And a lot of what the sources like the Living Standard Measurement Survey and would do is allow us to measure these better, particularly in poor countries. So I'll get back to that when I talk about the microdata. Okay, so in principle, you can do value-added accounting or gross output accounting. Either way is fine. The only difference is whether you're gonna let this intermediate input usage have a role or not in these output gaps. Okay. Now, an obvious question that you need to ask yourself is, okay, is that technology that I posed there the right technology to think about agriculture? And in particular, is a constant factor share technology adequate? So I always like this thing that, in particular in agriculture, if you had the opportunity to spend some time in poorer countries or in pockets of middle-income countries that are relatively poor, you will see that agriculture is very different than big plot agriculture in the Midwest in the US, okay? So there is massive differences in the way agriculture works with scale. So in principle, it is not crazy to think that factor shares are not constant, okay? So in the US time series, there is a lot of evidence that suggests that capital and labor are substitutable in agriculture. So a lot of what happens during the process of economic development is that agriculture goes from production mostly for subsistence to the market, but that the movement to the market is accompanied by increases in production scale, mechanization, and changes in the crops that are being produced. So that was what was in my first slide on this systematic movement from home production or subsistence level to market production. Now, across country, we not only have evidence of that capital labor substitutability in the time series, we have evidence of this across countries. There is a lot of evidence that suggests that there is capital intensification. There is a very nice paper in the JDE by Chow and Chen, and that there is substitutability, at least when you look at factor shares for a large set of countries. This is the work that Timo Bard and Hannes Malberg have been doing among others, okay? In the microdata, we also have evidence of substitutability. This is the work that I did with Namrata on an RCT trying to subsidize capital and show displacement effects to labor. So in principle, the technology that I use for my accounting might be misspecified, okay? And the question is, okay, to what extent? So if you look at the cross-country data on capital labor ratios, this comes from the paper by Chen, what you see is that there is a lot more capital intensification in agriculture than there is in non-agriculture, okay? So basically, the slope of the red line is higher than the slope of the blue line. But not only that, what is more important is that poor countries have lower capital and intermediate shares, okay? So basically, they produce these agricultural goods, with a different technology than rich countries. So how do you see that? Let's focus on, say, gross output shares here on the left panel. You have GDP per worker in 2005 on the x-axis, and then on the y-axis you have the factor shares. Here the factor shares are normalized to add up to 1, as if you have a constant returns to scale technology. Okay, and what do you see? Well, you see that in poor countries the land share is a bit above 20%. In rich countries that falls. But the other thing that you see is that the labor share is much larger than in rich countries, and that at the same time, both the capital share and the intermediate share increases with development. So what this is saying is, when I do my accounting, my poor man accounting the way I did it before, I might be missing the fact that there is intensification inputs as we move along the development spectrum. Okay. Now, let me go back to kind of the motivation of why we look at output per worker. So what I did so far is I show you, look, there are these differences in output per worker. These are the proximate sources from a macro perspective of what these output per worker differences are. Now, let's think about whether what do these productivity gaps imply for the gains from employment reallocation? Okay, so the fact that the output per worker gaps are largest in agriculture imply that the ratio of output per worker in agriculture to non-agriculture in poor countries is larger than in rich countries. I'm going to slow down here. This is not obvious. So the fact that the output per worker gaps are largest in agriculture, so the ratio between output per worker in agriculture in a poor country and output per worker in a rich country in agriculture are larger than in non-agriculture, implies that the gap between the labor productivity in agriculture and non-agriculture is larger in poor than in rich countries. And what we know from the work that Doug Gollin and David here did is that those gaps persist even after you adjust for the quality of the labor and the value added. You have different measures of value added, different measures of yield. Those gaps are still there. Now, the question is, okay, we see these gaps. Does this imply misallocation? Because in principle, if you have these different output per worker in different sectors, you would say, maybe I want to move workers out of the agricultural sector into the non-agricultural sector and generate gains. Now, the problem with this logic is that what we measure are average labor productivity. And that is different than marginal labor productivity, which is what is really under this argument that there might be gains from reallocating worker out of agriculture into non-agriculture. Now, what is the problem? The problem is that marginal labor productivities are hard to measure, okay? One of the key reasons why average labor productivity might be different between sectors is that there might be differential distortions, there might be differential factor intensities, there might be worker selection that may drive these average productivity gaps across sectors, while at the same time having this marginal labor productivity across sectors equalize. So there has been a lot of discussion, and I think there is still an active area of research to think about, can we have meta measures of these marginal labor productivities instead of just computing average labor productivities in agriculture and non-agriculture? I'm going to show you an example of that. Typically, what people have done is they have used longitudinal data on workers to try to track workers that move from the agricultural sector into the non-agricultural sector and see if they see this massive gain in wages, which through a simple theory will be related to output per worker, okay, when they relocate from one sector or the other. Here I'm going to show you data from Hamari et al. But you can see, this is from Kenya and Indonesia. You can see similar evidence from Alvarez in Brazil. They basically said, look, if you keep track of the workers, right, when they move from the rural sector to the urban sector, the gains in wages, so here the y-axis is the wage gap, okay, that they earn once they move to the urban sector is tiny, okay? So what this is saying is, well, the average output per worker might be very different in agriculture and non-agriculture, but on the margin, it seems that there are not these huge gains from reallocation. at least not when you look at this longitudinal data, which allows you to keep an eye on work and transaction. Now, as I said, okay, that doesn't say that these average output per worker gaps are not interesting. Maybe we want to look at them. And the obvious question, if you want to think about average labor productivity, is to think of, okay, what is generating this low average labor productivity in agriculture relative to non-agriculture, and the fact that this low average labor productivity in agriculture is so much lower in poor countries. So to do that, I want to start thinking about the micro. I want to start thinking about heterogeneity into what goes into our aggregate measure of output per worker. Okay, now, so to think about heterogeneity, I said at the beginning, here there is potentially a myriad of data sets that you can use to do that. I'm going to start with ICRISAT, but later on I'm going to start talking about the LSMS, which in my opinion are among the best data sets that will allow you to get at the micro heterogeneity in farms in a systematic way. The key advantage of ICRISAT is that ICRISAT will have a panel dimension to it, so you're going to be able to see many plots over time. That's also going to be a feature of LSMS. The other advantage that ICRISAT has is that it has high frequency data, which might be useful for some exercise. Now, what am I showing you here? So this is a plot that comes from Foster and Rosenzweig 2022 paper. They say, look, if you measure average profits per acre, which is what is on the y-axis, and you plot that against farm size in acres, you're going to find a U-shaped relationship. Okay? So this is a typo. This is a U-shaped relationship in profits and land size, not output per worker. I keep talking too much about output per worker. So what are they saying? They say, look, if you go and measure profits per acre, you're gonna see that they fall rapidly until 10 acres. This is data from India, and then after that they start to increase. So first fact is there is a lot of heterogeneity across farms in productivity. So under the hood of that average low labor productivity, there might be a lot of heterogeneity. But the second thing that they find is that it's not true that larger scale farms are necessarily more productive. They have this negative relationship, which, by the way, is a feature that micro development economies have been documented in many environments. Okay, so it's not particularly new to them. What is new to them is that the ICRISAT data allows them to get the full range of productivity difference. So what do they say? Well, they say, if you want to understand why productivity increases with land size, that has to be economies of scale. Okay, you can have better reap of the benefits of things like mechanization, which in turn increases your profits if you have larger plot sizes. Now, what explains the fact that as you become bigger, your profits per acre fall? Well, what they say is there might be some sort of frictions in the labor market. Now, this is interesting, and I'm showing you the data mostly so you can see the type of exercises that you can run when you open that box of just aggregate labor productivity. And if you want to think about frictions in the labor market, things like, is it hard to hire new workers for these family farms? It might be that there is a lot of variation within the season on your labor demand, and that makes these family farms decide not to hire more workers as they go along. One thing that is super neat about the micro data in agriculture is that you have all sorts of detailed information on what people do on the farm, okay? And that is available in many surveys in agriculture. I'm going to show you now data from a survey that we ran with Namrata for an experiment that we have in India, that basically allows you to say whether there is systematic specialization in the type of tasks that people do on the farm. Okay, so what are you seeing here? This is where the 0 here entry is family males, the 1 here entry is higher males. What you see here is that supervision labor is mostly done, so more than 80% of the tasks that entail supervision labor are done by the family males. Sourcing inputs is also something that is predominantly done by the family, whereas transplanting and harvesting are things that are done by hired labor. Now, why is this important? Because this may say, well, it's very hard to outsource or to hire labor to do things where moral hazard is problematic, but for other activities within the farm where moral hazard is not so important, you might be more willing to hire new workers. Why am I bringing up this data if I'm talking about labor productivity in agriculture? What I wanted to do here is I wanted you to highlight how detailed the data in the microdata in agriculture can be, and the tons of questions that one can answer if one is willing to dig deeper into what goes into this survey data. So there are a lot of questions that have to do with channels as of what generates that low labor productivity, and there is a huge amount of microdata in agriculture that will allow you to think about those problems carefully. Okay, now I want to go back to the issue of measuring productivity differences across farm in the micro, okay? The measure that Foster and Rosenzweig proposed is a measure of profitability, okay? What are profits? Profits are revenues minus costs. And now I want to start highlighting issues with measurement when you go to the micro data, okay? An obvious question that you need to ask yourself is, okay, which revenue is the revenue that you're accounting for? Is this the revenue accounting for home production? Is this the part of your production that goes to the market and you don't properly account for the part of your production that you use for subsistence? Which costs are you willing to put in this profitability measure? Are these just variable costs? Can you actually think about the rents to the fixed factors, for example, the return on the land? Okay. Now, these are all issues that go into the details on how to better think about the problems of primary data collection. And I think Meredith starts in a few weeks is going to be talking about that. So I won't spend too much time talking about it. But what I'm trying to say is the detail of the micro data in agriculture can be really good because it allows you to measure a lot of different channels, but at the same time, is delicate. Why? Because you need to think exactly about what is that is being measured, okay? It's not necessarily that what is being measured is the outcome that is useful for your study, okay? Now, what are productivity measures that one may wanna look at? You may wanna, at the farm level. At the farm level, you may wanna look at total factor productivity. Those would be ideal, but those are really hard to get. And I'm gonna talk a little bit about that, okay? What is a compromise to doing that? Well, we look at output per worker or revenue per worker or per hectare. Why do we do that? Well, because ultimately we care about things like the well-being of the workers, and having a measure of output per worker may be useful to understand how much these workers that are engaged in farming get to produce for their effort. An alternative measure that you see very often in microdevelopment studies is measures of yields, okay? Why do we see yields? Because yields are sometimes easier to measure than some of these measures of profitability and revenue. But then they have the real problem for a macro development economies, which are issues of aggregation, right? You may have yields that come from a farm, but the farm may produce different crops in different plots. So you actually need to aggregate across all these plots to be able to get a measure of the yield at the farm level. And the question is, how do you do that? Okay, so you will need output prices to be able to aggregate that. Okay, now How would you get at measuring farm productivity? Suppose you have the luxury of having measures of output, some measure of real output, Y, some measure of capital at the farm level, some measure of labor at the farm level, N, and some measure of land at the farm level. Okay. Now, again, factor shares can be potentially different across different farms, can be changing in time. But if you want to have any hope of identifying total factor productivity in the farm, you're going to have to put some restriction on the technology. Okay. One way to do that is to say, well, this alpha, this intensity of capital might be the same for all the farms that are producing this particular crop in a particular location. Or if you have the luxury of having panel data, you might be able to say, the factor share for this farm is constant in time and potentially heterogeneous across farm, but you're going to use the panel data to try to identify productivity. And the way you're going to do that is you're going to estimate this production technology in logs. So potentially you could run a regression of your output in real terms on capital inputs, labor inputs, and land, and your productivity will be the residual. Now, what's the problem of doing that? The problem of doing that is that TFP is unobserved and that your inputs are correlated with it. So if I am a more productive farm, I'm more likely to hire more capital. And the problem becomes even worse because it's not clear that randomized variation in inputs will allow you to construct, say, an IV to be able to identify factor shares and therefore identify residual productivity. Because if you, for example, develop an RCT that changes the availability of capital, and that availability of capital changes the technology for production, which I think is very possible, then that randomized variation is not going to satisfy the excludability restriction. Now, I can't possibly have time today to talk about the pitfalls of how do we actually estimate of production function estimation. And there is a huge literature in IO that does that. So here what I did is I put a link in the slide deck to the standard tools that are used in IO to estimate these productivity residuals. And let me just highlight that if you want to do this type of exercise using the LSMS, the Integrated Survey in Agriculture data is particularly useful if you are in the business of trying to estimate these production technologies. And I'm going to give you an example in a minute of this. Okay. Now, why is TFP useful? Well, the reason why you want to measure TFP potentially is because you want to understand, you want to be able to benchmark productivity gains from a wide variety of models. So, for example, if you assume that the technologies are identical across farms, basically the factor shares are the same, cost minimization implies that labor, land, capital are all proportional to that total factor productivity measure, and that output per worker should be constant across different farms. Okay. So an obvious question is, okay, is the dispersion in output per worker that we see in the microdata in agriculture a symptom of misallocation? Because the optimal cost minimization or the optimal allocation would say this should be constant, this should be all the same. Or potentially it's just measurement error. And I think Doug has a very nice paper in the JPE a few years ago where they tried to get at this question, which, by the way, is a really tough question to answer. Is this, heterogeneity that we measure in the microdata just pure measurement error or an actual symptom of misallocated resources? And they have a very clever identification, which is to say, let's use the fact that the LSMS ISA data has a panel dimension to it. And basically, you can keep track of farmers that produce the same crop in multiple plots. And then you can measure outcomes for the same farmer across these different plots. And potentially, that's just that heterogeneity is just pure measurement error because it's not clear that there is any friction that the farmer is facing when he plants plot 1 or plot 2 within his same farm. Okay, so that's at the high level, that's where the identification is coming from. And they basically say, well, look, if you look at compute TFP, total factor productivity, so if you look at the wider distribution here, this is for data from Tanzania, you're going to see that there is a lot of dispersion in TFP and total factor productivity. If you correct total factor productivity by measurement error, using the identification that they have, this distribution becomes narrower, okay? And basically what that implies is that there will be less role for misallocation. Okay, now the identification here relies on having very detailed data at the plot level for a farmer. So then again, when you work with microdata, you need to worry about issues of measurement error. So there is a paper by Aragon et al., actually, I missed that basically argues that potentially the plot is not the correct unit of analysis to study productivity. We may want to look at the farm. Why is that? Because the argument is that when a farmer, say, hires inputs, they're thinking about the farm as a whole. They're not thinking of a particular plot. And basically, when we ask, because of survey measurements, when we ask them to measure stuff at the plot level, they're more likely to make mistakes. One way to measure that is they look at self-reported and GPS measured parcels. Sorry, GPS measured parcels and farm sizes. And basically what you see here is the full line is what is the distribution of parcel sizes that is measured from GPS. And in dashed line is what is the self-reported. And you're going to see a lot more noise there. And they do the same at the household level or at the farm level. And then the heterogeneity that you see is much smaller. So in a way, they interpret this fact to say, oh, at the parcel level, there is a lot more measurement error. Again, why am I bringing this up? Just to tell you that the challenges of working with the microdata, you really need to make sure you're grasping what is that is being measured. I have very few minutes. I have just a few minutes, 1 minute, I think, to finish. So let me just finish up with another feature of productivity at the farm level that you may want to worry about. There is a key distinction between ex ante versus ex post productivity at the farm level. Why? Because when you think about agriculture, this is not just any random activity. Farming is risky, okay? Yields are sensitive to the timing of the agricultural activities. Weather shocks can change ex ante optimal outcomes, okay? And what this implies, for example, is sometimes economists like to look at input measures at the farm level as a better measure of productivity than just the realized yield or the realized profits, because those realized profits and yields might be affected by shocks that are exogenous to the farmer. And here what I'm going to highlight is that there are some of the LSMS ISA surveys that have different surveys at different stages of the agricultural production process. And that's particularly useful because then you're going to be able to see some of these gaps. So if you're interested in that question, I think taking a deeper look into the questionnaires of these surveys might be useful. Okay. There is an inability to insure against these risks. There is a literature that thinks about input decisions and technology risk shifting input decisions and technology choices. And this brings a whole question about the value of irrigation and storage technologies for agriculture. And I think something that is very important for macro development is that, and relatively still understudied, is that there are a lot of complementarities with other reforms that happen in the market. So agricultural productivity is not generated in a vacuum. It's not just technology in agriculture, right? Things like market access and infrastructure are going to be important. And I think, let me just finish with this one. There is another issue that is core to agricultural productivity, which is the issue of adaptation, particularly in a world where climate change is rapidly affecting us, okay? So adaptation can be interpreted in two dimensions. One is that the crops and the technologies that are suitable in rich countries may fail in poor countries. So it's not clear how you're going to do that technology transfer, and that agriculture may be facing differential costs of climate change. And here, just as a motivation, I show a picture that shows up in Ishan Nath job market paper that basically averages estimates of the cost of extreme weather effects that are concentrated in the agricultural sector and that are mostly concentrated in poor economies. And if you look at Africa, that's where most of the projected impact of climate change might be hitting. Okay, so when you think about agricultural productivity, you need to think about the moving target, right? That is in part responding and particularly affected by climate change. Okay, so let me just finish with this. I think it's hard to study the development process without understanding agriculture. We need to understand agriculture. Now, measuring productivity, you pick your measure of interest, output per worker, total factor productivity, if you have that luxury, at the micro level, yields, if the application is suited to that, is very challenging, but it's full of opportunities. And I hope that this slide deck kind of walk you through what are the challenges and what are potential avenues for improvement. Okay, the standard measures that we have out there, I think, are good benchmarks. They're a little bit too patchy for my taste still, but I think they're good benchmarks. There is still a lot of room for improvement. There is a lot of startup companies in poor countries that are increasing data availability. So potentially there is a lot of creative work that can be done bringing in private sector data into questions of macro development. We did that in some of my papers, and I think other people are exploiting that. There is a lot of opportunity for harmonization of existing surveys to the extent possible. And I think the LSMS effort from the World Bank has been very disruptive in that sense. And I think there is further room for study the link between climate change and agricultural outcomes. With that, I'll finish because I want to make sure I answer some questions.
Okay, excellent. Thanks so much, Julieta, for the great lecture. And we had a bunch of questions in the, during the lecture. Doug and I tried to answer some of them. So let's take some now. Can we start with Eric? Eric Ochiang. Eric, are you a suit? It's possible that Eric is, give me just a second here. It's possible Eric is, yeah, okay. So I have to promote Eric to a panelist. Sorry about that. I'm also going to say allow to talk. So Eric, if you can unmute, you go ahead and ask your question.
Yeah, thanks, David. Yeah, I wasn't a panelist. So my question was, in most of the developing countries, when we do the micro data collection, we realize that if you ask people if they do any economic activity, they will always say most say no. And even if they're farming, so you have to really be very, very specific and ask them to consider farming as an economic activity. And it always just makes me a bit kind of skeptical of the macro data that we have on agriculture, because it's interesting it will also be good to know how did they actually ask the question so that farmers consider themselves being economically active or considering that is an economic activity if they were engaging in agriculture. I'm not sure if the question is clear enough though.
I think it is, Eric. Should I collect questions or should I answer?
No, you can answer. I mean, you can give a brief answer.
I think just a big overview. I think we're very much on board, and that's why I brought up the issue heads on from the beginning, right? That the issue of self-employment is complicated. The issue of family inputs on the farm that basically go unaccounted for, both in terms of the cost of the family time as an input for production, and the fact that many times it's not properly measured, it is an issue. There are ways to get around it, and that's why I cited the paper that Doug wrote in terms of trying to think about factor shares. But when you try to adjust the factor share in a way, you are trying to adjust for the labor input for those that get unaccounted for. The measures out there are not perfect, but I think there are steps that one can follow to get at this issue, or at least to try to benchmark to what extent there is a bias and in which direction that bias may come. So, for example, if you look at the LSMS data, there is questions about the activities of every person in the household, okay? And it might be that your children work only part-time in the farm. Can you count for that labor as an input? Well, that's gonna be tough. In primary data collection, you can directly ask for this, but for standardized surveys, this is gonna be an issue. So we're very much on board. There are methods to try to at least measure the magnitude of the bias out there, and I think that's the best you can hope for.
So let's have Almudena. Please unmute.
Yes, hi, hello.
Hi.
On the first part of the presentation about the development accounting, where you talked about capital quality and the differences of the countries with the US, I think. I was wondering if variations in capital quality across these regions could be explained by differences in relative cost for agricultural workers, because like this accessing to comparable capital could be significantly more expensive for some countries than others.
So I agree. Two pieces of conflicting information on this. So our study suggests that there are systematic differences in the price of capital across countries. And yes, so in principle, that implies that even if the labor costs were the same, that's gonna have some implications for what's the relative price of capital to labor. The price of capital, because they're using lower quality, the price of capital is actually lower in poor countries relative to rich countries, but that doesn't say that the price of capital relative to the labor is lower. And what we do know, so in the micro data from our study on tractors, I think I should go back to the data and tell you what it is, but in the aggregate, we know, so in the aggregate for the overall capital stock, we know that, well, we know there are measures by Pete Clino that show that the relative price of capital to consumption is higher in poor countries, but that's not driven because the price of capital is very different, okay? So it's really that the price of consumption is much lower, and you can think of the price of consumption as indexing what the wages are gonna be. So the wages are relatively low. A broader way to answer your question is, I think we suspect there is something like what you are bringing into the table. I think more measurement will be useful.
Okay. Thank you.
Okay, thanks. Dauda, you had your hand up first. Can you please unmute? Dauda, we cannot hear you. Can you unmute?
Hello, I hope you can hear me now.
Now we can hear you, yeah.
Okay, thank you very much. I have two questions to ask, please. Number one is, when the presenter was presenting on the sectoral productivity gaps, she mentioned that the average labor productivity to marginal labor productivity is very hard to measure. I want to ask why. Why is it hard to measure? Then the second question is this. When she was presenting under the moral hazard label, she made mention that I don't know whether it is according to research results that transplanting is done mostly by family males. But if you look at agriculture generally in Africa, where mostly 70% of the farmers are just using traditional methods of agriculture, honestly, transplanting is not done by family males. It's mostly done by hired labor because family males cannot do a lot. But if you hired more people, they can do a lot in a day or within a few days. So this is just maybe a comment which I want to draw the attention of the presenter to this.
Right.
Thank you.
Thanks, Dauda.
Just so we can get to others, if you want to, yeah, give a good answer if you can, and a brief
Yeah,
answer.
just a brief answer is actually transplanting is an activity that is done by both hired labor and family labor. This is data from India, from our collection. It's not possible that depending when you go to Africa, that sorting of family versus hired labor is different. You had the question as of why marginal costs are marginal
Products.
labor productivity is hard to measure is because think about what you're trying to measure. You're trying to measure the return to moving the marginal worker, the worker that is indifferent between one sector and the other, measuring that worker as you change activities. Okay?
Yes.
Measuring that requires a lot more data, requires a lot more the quality of the data that you need to be able to do that, because you're going to focus on worker transitions, is much higher than what we typically measure, which is just we get this from aggregates. Okay. And even if you're willing to take, say, a model that says the marginal is some proportion of output per worker and some factor share, then you need to make sure that those factor shares are well measured. Okay. So even if you don't want to go micro,
Yes.
there are more challenges.
Yeah. Nicolas?
Hello, hi. Thank you very much for this. I'm very interested in doing research on land reforms, specifically in Latin American land reforms. And one thing that really has been getting in my mind in the last years is to try to understand the role of property rights on agricultural productivity. So, in the lecture, it's like you address all these issues related to factors, inputs, etc. But I was wondering if you can tell me something or maybe some literature that you know about the role that property rights play in all this agricultural productivity topic, because at the end of the day, in most developing countries, you have some sort of like a mingle of property rights going on there. And yeah, I would like to know your take on this. Thank you.
So I would say if you want to know about distortions in land markets in the macro development literature, you go to Diego Restuche's web, and you're going to get a bunch of that. So I quoted some of those papers as I was going along. Most of that study is structured, but there are literally, if you go to Diego's web, you're going to see studies of some case studies, very macro studies. There is that will give you a good initial point to start to read the literature.
Nadam, please unmute.
Okay. Good afternoon. Please, I don't know. Can I speak in French because I'm a French country?
No.
Or I have to speak in English.
Yeah.
Okay.
English.
So my English is not very, very, very well. So my problem is about technology adoption and decision of innovation in agriculture in Africa, because we are in Africa. They are doing traditional agriculture. So a lot of people in literature say that to put them, it is the smallholder farmers who give us our production, 80% of our production of the world. So to put them how to to give them security of their needs, we have to put them out of the poverty and give them technology innovation. So they have to adopt technology innovation. I want to know, I see in your presentation that you don't speak a lot about technology innovation. And you say in the last, I think the last slide, that to speak about technology innovation, we have to see the data of high countries. So in the poor country like sub-Saharan Africa, what we have to do about that? I also see that you said that we have also to speak about access of about infrastructure and markets. Yes, in Africa, what have we have to do about that for smallholder farmers? I don't know if you're understanding what I do in retail. I don't know.
I think I understand the questions. I'm not sure I have very good answers because this is an active area of research. I think I put that in my second or third slide. I think the question of do we really need technological change adapted to agriculture to generate development? That's an active area of research. And I think we know, I think I like, so if you read the Box Dev literature on agricultural productivity in Africa that is edited by Chris Udry and Tavneet Suri, you will see that kind of one of the takeaways that we know a lot of things that don't work. We know less about what would work. We have some hunch of what may work. But that's very much an active area of research. So I wouldn't venture answering that. And I think there are a lot of coordination problems that are hard to solve. That might be behind some of the outcomes that we see in Africa. But that's my own impression.
Let's one last question. We're over time, but just since there's a lot of questions. So Alamayu, do you want to ask the last question, please?
Okay, thank you very much. Also, I like the lecture. The lecture is very good, and it is very important for us, especially for PhD students. Okay, can you hear me, guys?
Yes,
we can hear you. Yep.
Okay, my question is: now I am as a PhD student. I'm planning to use the Living Standard Measurement Survey. And as the presenter mentioned earlier, there is the household level data and also plot level data. So now I am planning to use only the household level data. That means data that came from households or farmers self-reported. So that means I'm going to leave the plot level data. So what can you advise me on this?
What kind of?
That means I'm planning to use only the plot, the household level data, self-reported data. And
I didn't understand the question. Sorry.
Okay. I am asking you about the Living Standard Measurement Survey or a Living Standard Measurement Study that is the micro data. So I am doing my PhD on that data. So is there anything wrong if I use only the farmers self-reported data or household level data other than using the plot level data?
I don't think so. That's the survey data. We ask farmers to the extent possible. We do that. The GPS, so for example, for certain inputs like land, for example, or acres, you have the advantage of technology helping us measuring better some of that input. But I think there is nothing wrong using the survey data. There is going to be some measurement error in that, but if we're hoping that whoever is collecting the World Bank, when they're collecting the LSMS data, they're doing the best they can to try to generate good measurement of what is in there. So I don't think there is nothing else you can do but to use that data.
Okay, okay, thank you.
There was one related question actually in the chat, and I was looking for it and I didn't find it just now, but I remember that the question being about discrepancies between when you say how much land is yours, they say
Yes.
some number, and then
I just saw it. Yes.
and then you measure that. Then you measure that. You say, okay, well, show me where it is, and then you walk it, and you say, hey, it's not 3 hectares. It's 1.5 hectares or something.
So this is interesting because so I think that there are two ways to think about this problem. One is to say, well, people make more mistakes when you ask them about the plot instead of asking them about their farm. They own their farm. This is a family farm. They know pretty much what the size is. When you ask them about the size of a plot, they may be more prone of making mistakes. That's the picture I show you. There is another issue, which is, I think I would be really worried if the gap between their self-reported measure and the GPS measure tells you is predictive of differential input use, for example, across different plots. So to the extent that's just not noise, right? I will be worried. If it is just noise, so yes, they might not be able to tell you exactly what's the plot size is, but if you look at their input intake, they're fairly correct, and I wouldn't be too worried. But if the gap in their assessment, self-assessment, is predictive of mistakes in some way on their input usage, I think that's that's something that we should understand better.
Great. Okay, so let's stop there. Thanks everybody for coming. Thanks again, Julieta, for the great lecture. You can make reference to slides which are on the page. The next couple of lectures, we're gonna shift gears to trade and multinational production. We have Natalia Raimondo next week, followed by David Atkin. And those should be interesting lectures too. Thanks again, everybody. See you next week.